Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to talk about something vital to every believer's life, how to hear God clearly. If you've ever asked yourself how you can hear God's voice, how you can be sure that what you're hearing is truly from Him, then this message is for you. All communication with God is not a mere formality, it is the heartbeat of our relationship with Him. Just as in any relationship, communication must be clear, consistent, and reciprocal. Hearing God is not a mystical experience for a select few. It is a divine privilege available to every believer who desires it. In every meaningful relationship, communication is the foundation. You cannot claim to know someone unless you can communicate with them. Likewise, hearing God clearly is an essential part of understanding His will for your life. The primary way God guides and leads His people is through His voice. And it is not a voice that is distant or difficult to find. He speaks. The question is, are we listening? Imagine trying to have a conversation in a noisy room. The voices are all blending together, and it's difficult to make out anything clearly. In the same way, our lives are often filled with noise, distractions, worries, and pressures that drown out the still, small voice of God. To hear God clearly, you must create an environment that fosters His presence. The Bible says, "Be still and know that I am God." The moment you quiet your heart, still your thoughts, and remove external distractions, you invite God to speak to you in ways that are undeniable and clear. Create space mentally, spiritually, and physically for His voice to be heard. Just as any close relationship requires time, attention, and effort, so does your relationship with God. The more you engage with Him, the more you will be able to discern His voice. The key is intimacy. The deeper you go in your walk with God, the more attuned your spirit becomes to hearing His voice. God's voice is not a loud, thunderous sound. It is often gentle, subtle, and persistent. The more time you spend with Him, the more easily you will recognize that still small voice speaking to you, to your spirit. How do you recognize God's voice? Just as you recognize the voice of someone you know well. Recognizing God's voice requires familiarity. It's not enough to hear once in a while. You must spend time listening. The more you listen, the clearer His voice becomes. In moments of prayer and quietness, you must tune in. There are many voices in the world, voices of doubt, fear, and confusion, but the voice of God stands out like a beacon in the darkness. His voice is calm, clear, and always in alignment with His word. The more you read His word and align your heart with His will, the easier it will be to recognize His guidance. It is one thing to hear, but it is another thing to act on what you hear. Obedience is a critical step in hearing God clearly. When you respond in obedience, the channel through which God speaks becomes clearer. The more you obey, the more God trusts you with His voice. It is in the act of obedience that you position yourself to hear Him more distinctly. God does not speak for entertainment. He speaks for action. He speaks to lead, to guide, and to fulfill His purposes through you. When you hear, act. When you act, you open yourself to hear even more. Hearing from God does not always happen in an instant. There are seasons when His voice seems distant, and there are times when it seems like the heavens are silent. But the truth is, silence does not mean absence. God is always present, and His voice is always speaking. Sometimes we just need patience to hear it clearly. The key to hearing God clearly is persistence. You must persist in your prayer, your worship, and your time with Him. Be patient, trust His timing, and know that in due season He will speak to you with clarity. The more you continue seeking, the clearer the voice will become. Hearing God clearly is not just a desire, it is a necessity for every believer. It is the way we receive direction, encouragement, and purpose for our lives. By understanding the importance of communication, creating the right environment, developing a deep relationship, learning to recognize His voice, responding in obedience, and maintaining patience and persistence, we position ourselves to hear God clearly. As you go forward today, I urge you to commit yourself to the practice of hearing God's voice. Your life will never be the same once you begin to listen intently to His guidance. Remember, God is speaking. The question is, are you listening? Communication is the cornerstone of every meaningful relationship. Without communication, no relationship can thrive or even exist. It's the means by which we understand each other, express our desires, and establish connection. When we talk about hearing God clearly, we are talking about a vital form of communication between the Creator and His creation. Just as you cannot truly know someone unless you communicate with them, you cannot fully understand God's will for your life without actively engaging in a two-way conversation with Him. God, in His infinite wisdom, has chosen to communicate with His creation, but it is up to us to create the right atmosphere and mindset to hear Him. Many times we are quick to speak to God, sharing our worries, our desires, and our petitions, but we fail to give Him space to respond. It is essential to recognize that hearing from God is just as important, if not more so, than speaking to Him. In fact, the clarity of our communication with God begins with our ability to listen. Communication is not one-sided, it is a dialogue, not a monologue. We have to understand that God is always speaking, always trying to guide, comfort, and instruct us. But the question is, are we in a position to hear? The noise of our busy lives, our distractions, and our own inner turmoil often drown out His voice. Just as we struggle to hear a friend over a loud crowd, we sometimes struggle to hear God amidst the noise of our own lives. This is why it's so critical that we establish a rhythm of prayer and listening, not just speaking, in our relationship with God. Only when we pause, quiet our hearts, and actively listen will we hear the divine communication God has for us. True communication with God requires intentionality. We must be open to hearing His voice in whatever form it may come, whether it's through the scriptures, a gentle whisper in our spirit, or the counsel of others. Communication with God is not a passive experience, it requires engagement. When we understand this, we begin to realize the magnitude of God's desire to speak to us. The clearer we hear Him, the more effectively we can follow His guidance. And when we follow His guidance, we unlock the fullness of His purpose for our lives. At its core, hearing from God is not just about receiving information, it's about building a relationship. The depth of your communication with God determines the depth of your relationship with Him. Just as with any other relationship, the more time you invest in communicating with God, the clearer you will hear Him, and the more accurately you will understand His heart for you. In order to hear God clearly, it is essential to create an environment conducive to His presence and guidance. Just as we would not expect to hear someone speaking clearly in a noisy, chaotic space, we must also acknowledge that our spiritual environment impacts our ability to hear God. If our hearts and minds are cluttered with distractions, busyness, or anxiety, it becomes increasingly difficult to tune into God's voice. To hear clearly, we must first clear the space around us and within us. The first step in creating this environment is intentionally setting aside time to be still. In the rush of daily life, we often find ourselves caught up in the demands of work, family, and other responsibilities. These demands can easily overwhelm our ability to focus on what God might be trying to say. But when we intentionally create moments of stillness, whether through quiet prayer, meditation, or simply sitting in silence, we open ourselves to hearing from God. Stillness is not just about physical silence, it's about quieting the noise within us, our anxious thoughts, our worries, and our distractions. It is in these moments of stillness that we can become more attuned to God's gentle voice. A key component of creating the right environment is also establishing a sacred space for connection with God. This space doesn't need to be elaborate or formal, but it should be a place where you can be free from interruptions and distractions. It could be a quiet corner of your home, a park bench, or even a room dedicated to prayer and reflection. The physical space should serve as a reminder to your spirit that this is a place where you are intentionally seeking God's presence. The atmosphere of this space should be one that invites peace, focus, and reverence. When we cultivate such a place, it becomes easier to engage with God and listen for His voice. Additionally, the spiritual environment we create involves the mindset and attitude we bring to our time with God. It is not enough to merely sit in silence. We must approach this time with a heart that is open, expectant, and humble. It's essential to come before God with a willingness to listen and an openness to whatever He may reveal. This requires surrendering our own agendas, our own desires, and even our preconceived notions about how God should speak. Creating the right environment means positioning ourselves in a place of readiness, not only to hear God, but also to receive whatever He has to say. A key part of the environment we create is also the internal atmosphere we cultivate. Our spiritual lives are shaped by what we allow into our minds and hearts. The things we meditate on, the content we consume and deconsume, and the attitudes we nurture all play a role in shaping our ability to hear God. If our hearts are filled with bitterness, unforgiveness, or anger, these emotions create barriers between us and God. Likewise, when we fill our minds with distractions, negativity, or worldly pursuits, it becomes harder to tune into His voice. Thus, part of creating the right environment is actively working to cultivate purity, peace, and humility within ourselves. This means spending time in God's Word, practicing gratitude, and allowing His presence to fill our hearts, and minds. We must understand that hearing from God is not a passive experience. It is not something that happens by accident or coincidence. We must be deliberate in setting the stage for God's voice to be heard. Just as we would prepare for a meeting or an important conversation, we must prepare ourselves and our environment to hear from the one who has the answers to every question we could ever have. The right environment is a place of peace, stillness, openness, and reverence, where our focus is solely on God and His will for our lives. When we take the time to create such an environment, it becomes much easier to hear God's voice. In this space, free from distractions and filled with openness, we invite God to speak in ways that are clear and powerful. Our ability to hear Him is directly related to the environment we create. And when we cultivate the right space within and around us, we make room for God to move in our lives in profound ways. Developing a relationship with God is not a one-time event, it is an ongoing, dynamic process. Like any relationship, it requires time, effort, and intentionality. A deep relationship with God is built through consistent and deliberate interaction, not through sporadic encounters. When we speak about developing a relationship with God, we are talking about the journey of getting to know Him personally, intimately, and experientially. The more we invest in this relationship, the clearer His voice becomes in our lives. At the heart of any relationship is communication. It's not enough to simply speak to God and ask for things or share our struggles. A relationship is reciprocal. It requires both speaking and listening. Often we are quick to bring our requests to God, but true intimacy with Him is fostered when we take time to listen. This listening is not just about waiting for God to answer our specific prayers. It is about tuning into His presence and being sensitive to the subtle ways He speaks. The more we listen, the more we become familiar with His voice, and the easier it is to recognize when He is guiding us. But just as we cannot develop a deep friendship with someone by only talking to them once in a while, we cannot develop a deep relationship with God by only engaging with Him occasionally. Our relationship with God requires consistent time spent in His presence. This means intentionally setting aside time each day to pray, worship, read His Word, and listen. It is through these practices that we grow in our understanding of who God is, how He works, and how He speaks to us. Just as you get to know a friend by spending time with them, you get to know God by making Him a priority in your life. In any relationship, trust is a fundamental element. As we develop a deeper relationship with God, we also begin to trust Him more fully. The more we experience His faithfulness in our lives, the more we rely on His wisdom, His guidance, and His love. This trust is built through both the big and small moments of life, whether we are walking through a storm and see how He carries us, or whether we simply witness His daily provision and care. As we continue to trust God, we open ourselves up to hearing Him more clearly because we understand that He is good, that He desires what's best for us, and that He speaks in ways that lead us into His perfect will. Another essential element of developing a relationship with God is learning to love Him. As we spend time with God, we begin to realize the depth of His love for us. He is not distant, aloof, or detached. He desires a deep connection with His children, a connection that is rooted in love. The more we understand and embrace His love for us, the more our hearts are inclined to love Him in return. It is from this love that we are motivated to follow His voice, to obey His commands, and to pursue His will above all else. The foundation of a relationship with God is love, His love for us, and our love for Him. Furthermore, developing a relationship with God means embracing a posture of humility and surrender. It requires us to lay down our own agendas, our own understanding, and our own desires in order to receive His. It means trusting that His plans are greater than ours and that His voice is the one we should listen to above all others. Surrendering to God's will allows us to hear Him more clearly because it removes the barriers that come from our own self-reliance and pride. When we are humble before God, we make space for His voice to be the loudest and clearest in our lives. Lastly, relationships require intentional growth. We cannot remain static or stagnant if we are to build a deeper connection with anyone, including God. Just as in any friendship, growth comes from time spent together, from learning, from sharing experiences, and from adapting to new circumstances. With God, this growth comes from a life of continuous learning, seeking His guidance, and walking in obedience. The more we grow in our understanding of His word and our application of His principles, the clearer His voice will be. The deeper we go in our relationship with Him, the more intimate and personal our connection becomes. When we commit to developing a relationship with God, we move beyond a transactional approach to faith and enter into a profound transformational relationship. This relationship is not based on mere rituals or duties. It is built on a genuine desire to know God, to walk with Him, and to hear His voice clearly in every aspect of our lives. The more we prioritize this relationship, the clearer God's voice becomes, and the more deeply we experience His love, guidance, and direction. Through a committed and growing relationship with God, we come to hear and more clearly and live in the fullness of His will for our lives. Learning to recognize God's voice is one of the most profound and rewarding aspects of a believer's walk with Him. It is not something that happens overnight, but rather it is a journey that unfolds as we become more attuned to His presence and more familiar with how He speaks. Just as we recognize the voice of a close friend or family member, we must also learn to recognize God's voice through continual exposure and practice. However, recognizing His voice requires more than just hearing words. It requires discernment, sensitivity, and an understanding of His kenning of His character. The first step in learning to recognize God's voice is developing an intimate relationship with Him. The more we spend time in God's presence through prayer, worship, and reading His word, the more we familiarize ourselves with His voice. God's voice is not something that we can simply identify by sound or volume. It is identified by its essence. It is distinct and always aligned with His nature, His word and His word, and His will. Over time, as we immerse ourselves in God's presence, we begin to discern the subtle ways in which He communicates with us, whether through His word, our thoughts, our circumstances, or even the quiet whispers in our spirit. One of the key ways we recognize God's voice is by becoming familiar with His word. The Bible is the primary way God has revealed Himself to us. His voice is always consistent with the Scriptures. It will never contradict His written word. The more we read and meditate on the Bible, the more we attune our hearts and minds to what God's voice sounds like. It's important to understand that God will never speak in a way that contradicts His character or His promises. If we are unsure whether something we are hearing aligns with God's voice, we can test it by comparing it to His word. God's voice is not vague or erratic. It is clear and rooted in truth. Another aspect of learning to recognize God's voice is developing spiritual discernment. Discernment is the ability to distinguish between what is from God and what is not. It is crucial, especially in a world filled with many competing voices and influences. Often the enemy will try to mimic God's voice to confuse or deceive us, which is why discernment is so important. The more we grow in our relationship with God, the more sensitive we become to the subtle differences between His voice and the voices of fear, doubt, or temptation. When we hear a message or prompting, we must ask ourselves whether it aligns with God's character, His word, and His love. Discernment also requires us to listen carefully and patiently, as God's voice is often gentle and quiet, not loud or forceful. In addition, recognizing God's voice involves learning to trust His timing. God does not always speak when we expect Him to, nor does He always provide answers as quickly as we might hope. Sometimes God's voice is heard in seasons of silence, where He is inviting us to trust in His timing and His plan. During these times, it is essential to remain patient and steadfast, knowing that God's voice will be revealed at the right moment. Recognizing God's voice means being comfortable with the process, even when it feels like we are not hearing Him immediately. We must trust that He will speak at the right time and that His timing is always perfect. God's voice is also recognized by the peace it brings. When we hear God clearly, it brings a sense of peace that surpasses all understanding. God's guidance is not filled with confusion, anxiety, or fear. Instead, when he speaks, there is a deep inner peace that accompanies his words. Even if the message is challenging or requires change, his voice brings a calm assurance that we are on the right path. The peace that comes from hearing God's voice is a confirming sign that we are following his will. It is a peace that strengthens us in the face of adversity and gives us confidence in the direction he is leading us. In addition to peace, God's voice often brings clarity and direction. When we are unsure of a decision or uncertain about our next steps, God's voice provides the clarity we need. It is not vague or abstract, it is practical and clear, guiding us with precision. When we learn to recognize his voice, we begin to see how he leads us step by step, often in ways we didn't anticipate or understand at first. God's guidance is always intentional and purposeful. It will not leave us in a state of confusion or uncertainty. Rather, it will provide the clarity we need to move forward in faith. Recognizing God's voice involves a willingness to follow. Hearing God is not just about receiving information, it is about responding in obedience. When we hear his voice clearly, we are called to act on what he has spoken. God's voice may direct us to take bold steps of faith, to change our attitudes, or to make difficult decisions. The more we respond in obedience to God's voice, the more clearly we will hear him in the future. Our obedience opens the door for God to speak more deeply and more frequently into our lives. As we continue to grow in our ability to recognize God's voice, we also grow in our trust, our faith, and our relationship with him. It is a journey that takes time, but it is one that yields great rewards. The more we recognize God's voice, the more we align our lives with his will, and the more we experience the fullness of his guidance, peace, and purpose. Learning to recognize God's voice is not just about hearing words, it is about cultivating an ongoing relationship of communication, trust, and obedience that transforms our lives. Obedience to what we hear from God is the most crucial step in the process of hearing his voice clearly. It is one thing to hear God's direction and quite another to act upon it. In fact, true hearing is evidenced by our obedience. When God speaks, he speaks with authority, and his words are not merely suggestions or ideas for us to consider. They are instructions meant to guide our lives in alignment with his purpose. Obedience is the natural response to hearing God's voice, because in obeying him, we affirm that we trust his wisdom, his timing, and his heart for us. Obedience to God is often difficult because it requires a surrender of our own will and desires. It calls us to lay down our preferences, our comfort zones, and sometimes even our understanding of the situation. God's commands or instructions may not always align with what seems reasonable to us, or they may challenge us to take risks or step into the unknown. However, this is where true faith is demonstrated. Obedience is not based on what we can see or understand. It is based on trusting that God knows better than we do. His perspective is always higher than ours, and his plans for us are always for our good. Obeying what we hear from God, even when it doesn't make sense, is a declaration that we believe in his wisdom and his goodness. Obedience also brings clarity and opens doors for greater understanding. The more we obey what God speaks, the clearer his voice becomes to us. God's guidance is progressive. He will not reveal the next step until we've taken the first one. When we act in faith and obedience on what he has already spoken, he trusts us with more. Obedience acts as a key that unlocks further revelation and deeper intimacy with God. It is as if God is waiting for us to take the first step, and then he reveals more of his plan to us as we move forward. This process is not only about receiving direction, but about building a deeper relationship with God, as obedience demonstrates our trust and commitment to his will. Obeying God's voice also strengthens our spiritual maturity. It is one thing to hear God speak, but it is another to act on what he says, especially when it goes against our natural inclinations. In times of obedience, our character is refined. Each act of obedience shapes our spiritual life and makes us more sensitive to the voice of the Holy Spirit. God is continually molding us, preparing us for greater tasks, and teaching us to trust him more deeply. Through obedience, we learn patience, perseverance, and humility as we realize that God's ways are not always instant or easy, but they are always perfect. The benefits of obedience to God are abundant. First, obedience leads to blessing. In Scripture, we see repeatedly that God rewards those who are faithful to his commands. This doesn't mean that obedience is a transaction where we obey only to receive something in return. Rather, obedience places us in alignment with God's purpose. And when we are in alignment with God's purpose, we position ourselves to receive His blessings, both spiritual and material. Obeying what we hear from God may not always bring immediate reward, but it always brings a deeper sense of peace, fulfillment, and purpose, knowing that we are in the center of His will. Furthermore, obedience builds credibility with God. When we prove faithful in the small things, He entrusts us with more. If we are obedient to what we hear, God knows that we are capable of handling greater responsibilities. Our obedience to His voice, no matter how small or insignificant the action may seem, demonstrates our loyalty and faithfulness to Him. As we grow in obedience, we earn the trust of God, and He continues to guide us in more specific and profound ways. Obedience also brings freedom. It may seem paradoxical, but the truth is that when we obey God, we experience the freedom that comes from being in alignment with His will. Our lives become more orderly, our purpose becomes clearer, and the burden of self-reliance is lifted. When we obey God, we stop struggling against His will and stop carrying the weight of our own plans. In obedience, we find rest. Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest," Matthew 11:28. Obeying God's voice is the way to experience that rest, because we are no longer carrying the weight of our own will, but instead walking in the peace that comes from His guidance. The process of obedience also requires perseverance. It's not always easy to obey God, and at times we may face resistance, whether it's internal doubts, external challenges, or fear of what others may think. Obeying God's voice requires courage to step out in faith, even when the path ahead is unclear or difficult. But this perseverance builds character and strengthens our trust in God's provision. Every act of obedience is a step toward greater spiritual maturity, and every step of obedience increases our confidence in God's faithfulness. Additionally, obedience to what we hear from God aligns us with His kingdom purposes. When we obey God, we become active participants in His divine plan. Our obedience has a ripple effect, influencing not only our lives, but also the lives of those around us. By obeying God, we become vessels for His love, grace, and truth to flow through, impacting our families, communities, and even the world. In this way, obedience to God is not just about personal gain, it's about advancing His kingdom. Finally, obedience is the ultimate act of worship. When we obey what God speaks, we acknowledge His sovereignty over our lives. We are declaring that He is Lord, that His will is supreme, and that we are willing to follow Him wherever He leads. Obedience, therefore, is an expression of our love and devotion to God. It is our way of honoring Him with our lives, living out our faith in action, and demonstrating our trust in His perfect plan. In conclusion, obedience to what we hear from God is not simply an act of duty, it is a reflection of our relationship with Him. Through obedience, we deepen our connection with God, grow in spiritual maturity, and align ourselves with His will. It opens doors for greater understanding, positions us to receive blessings, and allows us to be part of His greater purpose. As we continue to obey, we experience the freedom, peace, and fulfillment that comes from walking in alignment with God's voice and His perfect will. Patience and persistence are essential qualities for anyone seeking to hear God's voice clearly and follow His guidance. These two virtues go hand in hand, as hearing from God often requires a process that stretches us beyond our immediate desires or expectations. Patience allows us to wait on God's timing, and persistence enables us to continue seeking His direction, even when the answers are not immediate or obvious. In a world that values instant gratification, these qualities can be challenging to cultivate, but they are crucial for anyone who desires to walk closely with God and receive His instructions. Patience is a quality that helps us understand that God's timing is different from ours. We live in a fast-paced world where everything is expected to happen quickly, from answers to prayers to immediate solutions to problems. But God operates on a different timetable. He knows the perfect timing for every aspect of our lives. Sometimes He will ask us to wait, not because He is distant or indifferent, but because waiting allows us to grow in trust and faith. It teaches us that His ways are higher than our ways, and His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. When we exhibit patience, we show that we trust God to unfold His plan in His perfect time. During times of waiting, God is doing more than just withholding answers. He is shaping our hearts. Patience teaches us to surrender our own understanding and lean into his wisdom. It builds endurance in us so we are better prepared for the next phase of his plan. The waiting period also allows us to deepen our relationship with God. Instead of rushing ahead with our own plans, we are invited to stay close to him, to continue praying, listening, and seeking his will. Through patience, we learn to rest in his presence and find peace in knowing that he is working, even when we cannot see it. Persistence, on the other hand, is the determination to keep moving forward, even when obstacles arise. It's the ability to keep seeking God, even when we don't get immediate results or when things seem unclear. Persistence involves continuing to pray, ask, and listen, even when it feels like there is no answer or when we are tempted to give up. It is the ongoing commitment to seeking God's will with unwavering faith, regardless of the challenges that may come. God honors persistence because it demonstrates our commitment to his voice and our willingness to stay engaged with him, even in difficult circumstances. The combination of patience and persistence works together to develop a deeper spiritual maturity. When we are patient, we allow God to work on us and refine our hearts. When we are persistent, we demonstrate our faith and determination to keep following God's call, regardless of the difficulties or delays we encounter. Together, they build a resilience in our spirits that helps us to persevere through life's challenges, knowing that God is faithful and that he will reveal his will in his perfect timing. In the process of waiting for God's direction, we must remember that his silence does not mean he is absent. He may be teaching us to trust, to listen more attentively, or to prepare us for what lies ahead. Persistence in seeking God, even when we don't hear from him right away, is an act of faith. It shows that we are not dependent on immediate answers, but that we are committed to following his voice no matter how long it takes. Persistence is also a sign of maturity. It reflects a heart that is willing to endure and remain faithful, even when the path is unclear. Moreover, both patience and persistence require a deep level of surrender. They challenge us to release our need for control and allow God to direct our steps. It's easy to grow frustrated when things don't happen as we hope, but when we practice patience, we release that frustration and trust that God has everything under control. Persistence requires the courage to press on, even when the road is tough and we may not see the immediate fruits of our efforts. It's a discipline of continuing to walk in faith, even when we feel weary or uncertain. Both qualities strengthen our relationship with God and help us to mature spiritually, making us more resilient, more faithful, and more obedient to his will. Patience and persistence also allow us to understand the deeper purposes behind God's timing. God is not in a rush. He is always working in the background, orchestrating events and preparing us for what is ahead. What we see as delays are often times of preparation, where God is setting the stage for something bigger than we can imagine. Through patience, we learn to trust his plan, and through persistence, we continue to pursue him, knowing that he is faithful and that he will fulfill his promises in due time. Furthermore, persistence and patience are especially important when faced with challenges or adversity. In times of trial, it can be easy to question whether we are hearing God clearly or whether he is even speaking at all. However, the ability to persist in seeking God during these times is an act of faith that strengthens our trust in his goodness. When we remain patient and persistent in the midst of difficulty, we learn that God's ways are not always easy, but they are always best. He uses the trials to refine us, to deepen our reliance on him, and to make us more like Christ. In the end, patience and persistence are not just qualities that help us hear God's voice. They are essential aspects of a lifestyle of faith. As we continue to wait on God and press forward in our pursuit of him, we are transformed. Patience teaches us to rest in his timing and to trust his process, while persistence keeps us moving forward in faith. Both qualities work together to build our character, deepen our relationship with God, and enable us to recognize his voice more clearly. They refine us into the people God has called us to be, helping us to live out his will with greater faithfulness and obedience.